Hi, and welcome to the 80th in our Middle Eastern and Islamic history series, North African Islamic history series. And today we're going to talk about the American wars in Iraq. So that's the Persian Gulf War, the interwar period, the Iraq War of 2003 to 2011, the Islamic State insurgency, and all of the surrounding political situation. The rules, for those of you who are unfamiliar: this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we are going to be discussing today. I am a layperson who cares about the Middle East. I hope that that makes up for whatever credentials I may lack. I'll try to keep the presentation neutral. So that's what I mean by secular. I'm not going to try and point it towards one side or the other. I'll talk about the negatives and the positives as much as I can from all the different sides. And of course, this, like all topics in Middle Eastern history, is sensitive. So let's be respectful. That said, interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. If the question is not directly appropriate to the material, I'll put it off to the question and answer period. When I say that this is a 101 and a 201, what I mean is that this presentation will cover all the bases. If you don't know anything about the subject, that's the 101. And if you already know something, I'll probably still tell you things you didn't know. That's the 201. What I like to say is that these presentations have a 2-hour hard stop, which means that if at 9 p.m. Eastern time I haven't covered all my slides, that's okay. It'll just roll on into next week. And then we will go to the Q&A period. And as I mentioned in the Q&A period, of course, I will address questions that have come up during the session that were not appropriate to be answered during the session, as well as give people the opportunity to raise their hands and speak. So that way, if they have questions or they want to just talk about some of the topics, we can definitely do that. When I put the dates for individuals, if it's a politician, that's usually their dates of service in whatever political role that's relevant. And if I put a thought leader, the dates are their actual lifespan. One other thing to note, that this is different from a lot of other presentations. There will be some disturbing or lightly disturbing images because we are going to be talking about horrors that come out of war. So for those who are otherwise disinterested, I'll let you know when we're going to get to those slides, but that is definitely something that will be in this presentation. This, like the other members of the Middle Eastern History Series, will be recorded, and you can see all 79 of the previous recordings on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel to get all of the videos and to watch them out of sequence, so that way you can see the trajectory of any particular region or to catch up on information that you may have forgotten. You can also see all of the other series that are covered that Zach had just finished enumerating before we started. So you can see the full gamut of things that we cover. And of course, if you want to be in the Zoom, if you want to participate in the questions, please join our meetup, and you will get links to all the different Zooms that our group puts forward. And of course, we will continue to do these presentations for free. That said, we love anything you can do to help us pay for the cost of premium Zoom, premium Meetup, and premium YouTube. So you have PayPal and Buy a Coffee as 2 ways to help contribute. And with that, I'll begin. So we've covered Iraq for 2 successive weeks now. This is the 3rd week. And we saw several fundamental issues with Iraq, and a lot of these will start to melt away, especially as we move into the post-Cold War era. For example, the Arab Cold War alliances aren't going to mean much when the Soviet Union stops existing. But of course, that's going to be a huge problem for Iraq, because Iraq had been an ally of the Soviet Union throughout the 1970s and 1980s. We're going to see increasing instability in Iraq, especially with the fall of Saddam. And so while there aren't coups, there will be political assassinations, and that in many cases tries to fill the same role. We're going to see an increased importance in the ethnic and religious diversity of the country. Of course, Iraq is known for 3 dominant ethno-religious groups. You have Sunni Arabs, Shiite Arabs, and Kurds of a variety of different religious groups, but they tend to function more as one unified ethnic group than they do based on their religious divisions. But of course, that is an oversimplified perspective of the ethnic and religious diversity of Iraq. And we're going to talk about a number of the other minorities, such as the Mandians, such as the Yarsani, such as the Assyrians, such as the Shabaki, throughout this discussion today, where we will see their import as minorities and their relative outsized pain or trauma throughout this period. We're also going to see a new resurgence of Kurdish nationalism, and how does that play against the historic pan-Arab view within Iraq, and how does it now contrast with a more pan-Shiitic view because of Iran's influence. And so we're going to talk about those sorts of issues. We're also going to talk about how there is this sense under the Saddam period of constant governmental paranoia going to a sense of constant paranoia about how useless the government is. And we're going to see that rapid shift, especially in the wake of the American war in 2003. All right. So to take us back, in July 17th of 1968, we had a military coup d'etat led by the Baathists. At that time, they were led by Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, and Saddam Hussein was his vice president. But starting from the early 1970s, Saddam, even in the role of vice president, was assuming more and more of the direct functions of the state. And he was responsible, for example, for creating the Mukhabarat, or the intelligence agency of Iraq. And the Mukhabarat was particularly known for arresting numerous individuals, torturing them, and trying to exact confessions. This created a climate of fear and paranoia within the country of Iraq throughout the 1970s for those who had distinct political opinions from those harbored by the Iraqi government. We also saw that in the 1970s, last week, that Saddam Hussein was able to rebuild the relationship that Iraq had previously not been able to completely consummate with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union in the 1970s assisted Iraq in the development of an advanced economic situation, meaning that when Iraq finally nationalized its oil during the 1970s, the Saudis helped create the Iraqi National Oil Company and provided technicians so that the Iraqis could maintain it. Right, that was one of the fundamental issues that Abdul Karim Qasim had when he wanted to nationalize the oil in 1959, but he couldn't because Iraq didn't have the educated technicians who would be able to run it without Western support. And also, because Saddam Hussein had unified his relationship with the Soviet Union was going to be less supportive of the Kurds, who had historically been beneficiaries of Soviet influence in order to counter the Americans. And this meant that Saddam was able to concentrate more power into his own person, as well as building up the country using the oil wealth from that period. And the oil wealth came both from the fact that the Iraqi Petroleum Company, a company entirely controlled by non-Iraqis, was taken over by the Iranian National Oil Company in 1972, and also the fact that there was the Arab boycott of oil in 1973, which Saddam did not participate in. But because he didn't participate, he was able to make record profits from all the oil that he was selling, whereas other Arab countries were not. And during the 1970s, we see a massive improvement of the quality of life in Iraq for those Iraqis who were on the positive side of the regime, that weren't causing political disturbances, at least from the perspective of Saddam Hussein. And so we see large-scale campaigns for the eradication of illiteracy, along with compulsory free education in Iraq for both men and for women. In fact, the women in the cities begin going to universities. We start seeing the development of modern hospitals and other treatment centers in Iraq. In fact, by the end of the 1980s, the way of life in Iraq was actually more similar to Western European states than many of the other Middle Eastern states, in that people had a certain degree of healthcare, people had a certain degree of education. The infrastructure projects that he had created resulted in electrification of the whole country, as well as a large-scale highway system. And in the rural areas, he also implemented subsidies and farmer collectives, allowing a lot of individuals to become part and parcel of the ownership structure of their farms in a sort of way, right? Because these collectives are government owned, but that meant that these sharecroppers effectively were able to own the products of their labor, the grains that they were producing. And so by the mid-1970s, you have a significant percentage of the Iraqi rural population that is enamored with Saddam Hussein for increasing the number of collective farms and for allowing these groups to become more and more effective in maintaining their own standard of living. And as the economic situation in Iraq was improving, the situation vis-a-vis the Kurds began to deteriorate. Now, in 1970, Iraq had been unable to subdue the Kurds, due both to Soviet, Iranian, and Israeli aid to the Kurds, and a lack of effectiveness on the Iraqi side during the 1960s, all those constant turbulent coups and the inability to have effective military commanders meant that by 1970, Saddam Hussein had agreed to an interim Iraqi Kurdish autonomy agreement that would have given the Kurds significant power over the future of their region. However, with the consolidations that occurred between 1970 and 1974, when the autonomy agreement was to be implemented, Iraq decided that it would be more effective to launch another war against the Kurds and restate its new position, now with a 1972 alliance with the Soviets, now with more effective tanks and military equipment, and with, in 1975, the removal of Iran from the table. In the middle of the war with the Kurds, Iraq was willing to concede to Iran some territorial concessions along the Shatt al-Arab, the Arab coast, which is the region of Iraq that touches the Persian Gulf. It's a very small corridor, and we'll definitely talk about that a lot more when we talk about Kuwait. But some of that area was contested between Iraq and Iran, and Saddam Hussein, in the Algiers Agreement of 1975, was willing to give that territory to Reza Shah of Iran in order for the Iranians to stop funding the KDP and the PUK. So despite the fact that the US found it useful to help the Kurds now, in opposition to the Soviet-funded Iraqis, without Iran being supportive, there was simply no way to do that. Turkey was not going to allow the funding of a Kurdish insurgency in Iraq, primarily because that would lead to the funding of the support within Turkey of a Kurdish insurgency, which they would not allow. From a diplomatic perspective, Iraq inherited the leadership of the Arab world as a result of the 1979 shift. And what this shift meant was that Egypt, which had been the primary leader of the Arab world, especially during the Nasser years of the 1960s, was now reviled in the Arab world for making peace with Israel. And because of this, and they're cozying up to the Americans, there was now a new opening in the Arab world for a different kind of leadership. And so Saddam Hussein, especially even starting as early as 1978, when the Camp David Accords began, staked out his role as the single largest Arab state other than Egypt in terms of population, excusing certain parts of North Africa, and his powerful military, especially as we move through the 1970s, to consider himself the leader of the Arab world. And in fact, he began to sort of inherit that role as we move into the 1980s. And at the same time, during the 1979 shift, is when Saddam Hussein is able to secure his own power. Now, it's believed that Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, who was still the president of Iraq in 1979, was becoming increasingly frail and old, and he did not want to rule in his own stead. But he thought the most effective way to do this was through a union with Syria. Now, remember, Hafiz al-Assad, who's the president of Syria, is also a Ba'ath Party member. And so because the Syrians are Ba'ath and the Iraqis are Ba'ath, why don't the two Ba'ath parties just unify in one state? And if that would be the case, Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr would become the president because Iraq was larger, and Hafiz al-Assad would become the vice president because he was already the ruler of Syria. and that would have marginalized Saddam Hussein and his rule. So accordingly, Saddam moved quickly in order to secure his power, and he began what's known as the Purge, where he brought all of the members of the Ba'ath Party into a meeting. The meeting was videotaped, so we still have it. And in that videotape, he required Mohi Abdul Hussein Mashhadi, who was a member of the Ba'ath Party who did not like Saddam Hussein and didn't think him an effective leader. He was testifying that there was a grand conspiracy to destroy Iraq on behalf of Hafiz al-Assad and the Syrians. And so, accordingly, he implicated 66 other individuals, all individuals that were not interested in seeing Saddam Hussein succeed Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, in order for Saddam to now create a core of Ba'ath Party support that didn't exist. Mohi Abdul Hussein Mashhadi, of course, was executed, as were a number of those 66. Others of them were imprisoned for substantial periods of time. And this, of course, solidified a negative opinion between Saddam Hussein and Hafiz al-Assad. Now, it's worth, again, talking about what it means to be a Ba'athist, because Baathism is in this weird position when it comes to Iraq, in that Iraq is a multi-ethnic country, and Baathism is Arab nationalism. So what we have here is a situation where, because Iraq is multi-ethnic and multi-religious, Arab nationalism, which has key elements purporting to the superiority or the organizational power of Arabs as Muslims, Saddam Hussein had to widen the ambit of what it meant to be an Arab nationalist in the Ba'ath Party in order for it to be a party that all Iraqis theoretically could join. And in fact, he had leaders who were from various different minority groups. As I mentioned last week, Taha Yassin Ramadan al-Jazrawi is a Kurdish leader who became the head of the Iraqi Popular Army. And Tariq Aziz, born Mikhail Yohana, his name Tariq Aziz was an Arab nickname that he took on later in life, became the foreign minister for Iraq through nearly the entire Saddam presidency. And both of these individuals, al-Jazrawi as a Kurd, Tariq Aziz as an Assyrian Christian, were outside of the general understanding of the Arab nationalism, but within the nationalism that Hussein was creating, they were acceptable. And why were they acceptable? Because he hybridized Arab nationalism with Iraqi nationalism to a certain degree. He created this idea of the Iraqi civilization that itself had embraced Arab culture and Arab traditions. And to the extent that modern Iraqis were going to be a part of an Arab world, they could be part of Arab nationalism. And both Taha al-Jazrawi and Tariq Aziz spoke Arabic when around Saddam Hussein, when engaging with the Arab world, and so they were accepted as part of this world. I would further point out, for example, you can see the Babylonian bricks where these are actual bricks from the city of Babylon, where Saddam Hussein defaced them with the carving of his own name in them to sort of create the longevity that he is coming from the Babylonian civilization. Now, there's a question here: would Hafiz al-Assad really have accepted a second position in a new Iraq-Syria? Seems like a bad deal for him. It's very questionable, I agree, whether Hafiz al-Assad would have done that. My intuition is that he would have accepted it on paper, and then as soon as the union occurred, if it did occur, he would have made sure that Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr was retired. In much the same way, actually, that Saddam Hussein did when he performed the purge in 1979. Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr was retired. He went to what was effectively house arrest while he was sick, and he died in 1982. So I think that Hafiz al-Assad would have basically done the same thing. And now, once you have this unification of Iraqi nationalism and Arab nationalism in the person of Saddam Hussein creates a personality cult, which supersedes a lot of the personality cults that we see in the Middle East, with him being sort of the harbinger of Iraq's future in that view. Now, I mentioned that I was going to describe what the Iraqi Popular Army was, and to a great extent, this should show why it's so difficult to overthrow Saddam Hussein, and we're going to get through some of that today. In particular, it's the fact that in addition to the Iraqi army, this Iraqi Popular Army existed, which was a citizen conscript army led by al-Jazrawi, which operated entirely separate from the army chain of command. So if it were the case that the army wanted to rebel and overthrow Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi Popular Army would attack the army, and vice versa. And so since you had two different military organizations that shared absolutely no commanders in common, you had a situation where neither one would risk antagonizing the state for fear that the other would come after it. Now, during the same time, after the 1979 shift, a very different shoe fell, and that was that Iran, which had previously been relatively isolationist in its outward perspective, we've talked about how Iran under the Shah intervened in Oman and funded the Kurds in Iraq. But Iran, as a general matter, didn't send soldiers throughout the Middle East. They didn't send individuals trying to ideologically convert on their behalf. But the new Islamic Republic did it, and they tried to evangelize their new ideology, Vilayat al-Faqih, or guardianship of the jurist. And they were able to evangelize this ideology to those states with large Shiite populations. And of course, Iraq had the largest Shiite population outside of Iran, which made it a prime target. Of course, other Shiite states had earlier political success, such as Lebanon, where Iran's Hezbollah became part of the governing pro-Syrian apparatus rather quickly in the wake of the Ta'if Agreement of 1991. But one of the interesting things, of course, is that Iran found a natural ally in Syria. And this seems strange, considering that Assad was an extreme secularist, and he was part of the Alawite minority, which is an offshoot of Shiite Islam. But Ayatollah Khomeini saw in Hafiz al-Assad a key partner in boxing Iraq in, right? Because Iraq is ruled by Saddam Hussein, who's thoroughly anti-Shiite in his perspective. And he sees him as an ally in terms of expansion into Lebanon and getting a closer position on attacking Israel and, in his view, liberating Palestine. So he's able to look past the kind of person that Hafiz al-Assad was in terms of how he ruled Syria as a potential alliance partner. And for those of you who remember episode 77, Hafiz al-Assad looks very similar to a lot of the Iranian politicians in 1979 and 1980 from Islamist parties that were a little bit more left-leaning and that Khomeini could not stand in the least. So it's very interesting to see that as a foreign leader, he's willing to accept Hafiz al-Assad, when in domestic politics, he wasn't willing to accept similar candidates. And of course, there was an extent to which the Vilayat al-Faqih ideology spread in Iraq. Most prominently, it spread among what were called the Siri, the Supreme Council of the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, that was led by Ayatollah Muhammad Baqir al-Hakim al-Tabatabai. And al-Tabatabai was able to get a significant portion of Iraqi Shiites behind the idea that a revolution against Saddam Hussein would need to happen, and that would need to be supported by a Vilayat al-Faqih new state. You can even see the relationship between Syria and the Islamic State as really put together when Omar al-Hakim, who was the successor to Tabatabai, visited Ayatollah Khomeini in the hospital in September of 2014. But just because some Shiite Ayatollahs were convinced by Vilayat al-Faqih, the guardianship of the jurist, this political philosophy coming out of Iran, not all the Shiites were. And so you had two major camps in the Shiite world opposite from the Vilayat al-Faqih path. Probably the most prominent was that of Ayatollah Ali Sistani. And Sistani was probably the most important marja or Shiite Ayatollah who had authority to issue fatwas with binding effect in numerous areas. And his view was that the Shiites should do what the Shiites always did, which is that they influence politics from the position of lay political religious leadership. For a perspective on what this would look like in an American context, think of a Jerry Falwell, right? You're talking about a very powerful religious individual with a large constituency who can convince people about how to vote and what to vote, but yet never holds or aspires to hold political office himself. And so that was the dominant perspective among Shia. And we're going to see, again, these three perspectives, the third one I'm just going to mention in a second, manifesting in the post-Saddam period as well. The third perspective was that supported by the Islamic Dawah Party and historically their leader Ayatollah Muhammad Baqir as-Sadr. And as-Sadr wanted to create a secular republic, one in which Shiites were a constituent part and one in which Shiites would have all their rights respected, but would not be based on necessarily religious values or religious governance, as would be the case with Tabatabai. In his view, Ayatollah Khomeini misunderstood the role of the guardianship. The guardianship of the state doesn't belong to the jurists, it belongs to the people overall. And so the natural result of that would be a republic or some kind of elected system that represents the will of the people. And so this Dawah party did try to assassinate Saddam Hussein in 1982. They were unsuccessful, and that resulted in Saddam coming to the town of Dujail and committing a massacre of 144 Shiites. That was the city where Islamic Dawah party was the strongest. And these individuals were killed indiscriminately as part of a massacre. We also see that Iraq creates an alliance with a number of Iranian organizations that were anti-Islamic Republic. The Mujahideen al-Khalq was one of the groups that had revolted against the Shah, but was quickly ostracized by 1981 by the Ayatollah and relocated to Iraq, where they began to be supported by Iraq, especially as Iraq entered the Iran-Iraq War. And the Iran-Iraq War, as we discussed last time, was a very difficult war. It was started with Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran, crossing the Iraqi border eastward and undoing the Peace of Algiers of 1975. But by 1982, using human wave tactics and other brute force solutions, the Islamic Republic was able to push the Iraqis not only back to the border, but to start an offensive against Iraq. And Iraq began suing for peace as soon as June of 1982. And so this changed the war from being in a war of Iraqi aggression, primarily to stop organizations like Syria, right? That pervasion of the Vilayat al-Faqih philosophy into Iraq, as well as Saddam's desire to acquire the oil wells in the Arab, the region with significant Arab population in Iran, Khuzestan, which was the primary area of his invasion, if you see the map there, into an Iranian war of aggression on Iraqi territory in order to force the Iraqis to pay for everything that they'd been doing to Iran. And of course, during the war, Iraq used a number of chemical and biological weapons against Iranian soldiers. They had more advanced equipment. In fact, the Iraqis were supported by nearly every major power, including both the United States, the United Kingdom, and several communist countries like the Soviet Union, East Germany, and China. So what you end up having is a war where a better armed, smaller country is fighting off a much larger but worse armed country in the form of Iran. And you can see, for example, Donald Rumsfeld making an alliance with Saddam Hussein in 1983, helping to support him with American weapons. And we also see at this point that Arab states are like Kuwait, like Saudi Arabia, are funding the Iraqi side by providing them significant amounts of money. Now, the war drives Iraq into massive debt. It doesn't do the same for Iran. Iran has assets that it can use to offset a lot of the expenses that it's making, but Iraq does not. And so what ends up happening is that Iraq ends the war in a state of economic ruin. One of the other important things to talk about the Iran-Iraq war was the domestic war within Iraq. Now, Iran and Iraq had been using the Kurds within the borders of the other state as proxies for quite a while. And so it's not a surprise that the Iranian government again reached out to the Kurds. Now, of course, this was a different Iranian government than the one that they had dealt with before. They'd previously been talking with the Shah. Now it was the Islamic Republic. But money is still money. So what ends up happening is that Saddam Hussein, using American dual-use technologies, these are technologies that have both a civilian and military use, is able to begin a war against the Kurds using these dual-use materials to create poison gas weapons, nerve gas, mustard gas, things of that nature, including most famously his attack on the town of Halabja, where 4,000 people were killed on the 16th of March, 1988. But overall, in the wider Anfal campaign, thousands of Kurdish villages were destroyed, both by Iraqi Arab soldiers and by what are generally called the National Defense Battalions, often called the Jash by the Kurds, meaning traitors. These were Kurdish individuals who fought on behalf of Saddam Hussein and his state against fellow Kurds and either killed them or simply stole their belongings as part of the extermination campaign that Saddam was running. And he called this extermination campaign Al-Anfal because this is a surah in the Quran, meaning the treasures or the booty, in the sense of what you take when you are victorious. And so you can see him using the Islamic veneer to cover up what is effectively a political maneuver, and securing the legitimacy of that maneuver with that religious veneer. In this conflict, we also see targeting at a higher percentage of the Assyrian minority. Now, these are Christians who live in the northern part of Iraq, and they speak an Aramaic language. They typically live in the territory that is majority Kurdish at this point, but of course that is the result of the 20th century politics, which saw a genocide of their people in several different waves. So at this point, you have the Assyrian Democratic Movement, or Zawa, meaning the movement, that fights in parallel with the Kurds against Saddam Hussein, and is directly targeted because they represent a negative counterpoint to people like Tariq Aziz, who are Assyrians who Arabize, and these are Assyrians who refuse to Arabize. They refuse to take on Arabic culture, Arabic names, Arabic senses of identity, and instead see themselves as a distinct ethnic group. And this is one of the things that is very difficult for foreigners to, I think, to understand about the Arab ethnicity. The Arab ethnicity is as much about choice as it is by birth, in the sense of if a person chooses to be Arab and looks similar to an Arab, right, and they speak Arabic and they live in an Arab country, most people will consider them Arab. The only exception that I can think of is if somebody is East Asian, then there's no way that they could look Arab. But there are even comments about a famous Korean who grew up in Saudi Arabia, and he speaks Arabic perfectly fluently, as to whether he's Arab or not because of the cultural connection there. But especially with minorities that live in the Middle East, they are Arab either by choice or by force. And of course, this is a question that most non-Arab minorities say that they're not Arab by choice and they're not Arab by genetics. And of course, Arabs will disagree because they may speak Arabic in their daily life and so on and so forth. And in Saddam Hussein's perspective, these individuals who refused to Arabize were enemies of his state. So we then get to the situation at the end of the war in 1988, where Iraq is in a massive economic hole, and it requested from a number of the countries from which it had taken financial loans, like Kuwait, like Saudi Arabia, to cancel their debt. In the view of Saddam Hussein, the actions that he had taken in the Iran-Iraq war had been for the defense of all of the Arab world against Vilayat al-Faqih and the wider Iranian conspiracy over the Arab world, the Iranian conspiracy to create a group of Iranian-aligned countries and break up the Arab world. And he felt that he had done his duty by sacrificing over 500,000 Iraqi soldiers in preventing that situation from happening. The Kuwaitis didn't quite see it that way, neither did the Saudis, and they refused to forgive his debt. The irony, of course, of this will be that in order for the United States to court a number of Arab allies like Egypt in the later Persian Gulf War of 1991, George Bush actually was willing to forgive Egyptian debt to the United States, right? So it's sort of this weird thing of the Arabs are not willing to forgive debts to each other, but the West is willing to forgive Arab debt in order to reset the balance. And Saddam Hussein made an accusation that Kuwait was engaging in what is called slant drilling. Now, slant drilling is the idea that literally, instead of drilling straight down for oil, you drill at a slant. And if the border is here, you've now drilled into the oil well of another country. Most scholars repudiate the slant drilling accusation for several different reasons. The first one is that, as you can see from this picture, the Rumaila oil field, which is the name of the oil field on the Iraqi side, and the Ruqa oil field, which is the name of the oil field on the Kuwaiti side, are literally just one oil field that doesn't know borders. And so Kuwaitis wouldn't have to slant drill to get access to the Ruqa oil field. They can drill straight down. And it happens that when you have an oil well, the country that takes the oil is the one that's pulling it up through the pumps more quickly. It's the same as if you have two people both drinking a beverage out of a straw. It's not that one person has to drink the water from the other person's side or drink the beverage from the other person's side. Simply by drinking from the same cup, you're going to pull up whatever water there is. And that's basically what happens with regards to slant drilling. But this slant drilling was a pretext for Saddam Hussein to engage in his next action, which was to put additional pressure on Kuwait to give him a relaxation on the debt. And so on 25th of July in 1990, Saddam Hussein met with April Glaspie, who was the United States ambassador to Iraq, in order to understand the situation. And he argued to her that he felt that he was the victim of a conspiracy, that nobody was willing to forgive his debt, and that lessons should be shown to Kuwait. And he asked her specifically, what would be the American response if something were done to Kuwait, especially concerning the Kuwaiti border? Now, if you look at the slant drilling picture, you can almost see a little bit. There are several islands off the Iraqi coast that are Kuwaiti islands, and those had been disputed between Iraq and Kuwait for a while. Never mind, of course, that Saddam's opinion was, and this was the opinion, as we saw, of both Nouria Saeed and Abdul Karim Qasim, all political figures from very different sides of the political spectrum throughout Iraq's history, that Kuwait as a totality was part of Iraq, split off by the British as a form of imperialism. And Saddam Hussein pressed April about the situation in Kuwait, and she said that Arab conflicts are not a concern of the United States. Saddam Hussein took that to mean that if he invaded Kuwait, there might be some sort of condemnation, but no actual functional reprisal. Now, other Arab states also condemned the actions of Saddam Hussein. Egypt was one of them. And so Iraq expelled all of the Egyptian guest workers in the country. Conversely, some countries were very favorable to the actions of Saddam Hussein, like the Palestinian leadership under Yasser Arafat, which had received significant funding from Saddam Hussein. And because of Yasser Arafat's support of Saddam Hussein, the Kuwaitis themselves would expel a significant portion, if not all, of their Palestinian guest workers in the wake of the Persian Gulf War. Now, when Saddam Hussein approached the Kuwait border in August of 1990, there were still numerous attempts to bring Saddam and the Kuwaitis to the negotiating table, and Saddam literally left the conference that morning and invaded that evening. And that was August of 1990. Now, Saddam Hussein made quick movements, and in fact, the entire country fell. The entire country of Kuwait fell in about a day and a half. But Saddam Hussein had one primary objective, which was to capture the emir of Kuwait. And he failed. The emir got over the border to Saudi Arabia, as did many different Kuwaitis, and the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, Saud Nasser Saud Sabah, met with George Bush in order to discuss what could be done in order to resuscitate the Kuwaiti emirate. Now, Saddam, in control of Kuwait, actually annexed it as his so-called 19th province. And you can see the map here of Iraq of what it looked like in late 1990 before Operation Desert Storm in February of 1991. Now, what ends up happening during the period from the 8th of August until the beginnings of 1991 is that we have a lot of movements that set up almost a pretext for the oncoming struggle. The United States, reacting to the Kuwaiti ambassador, declares that the Iranian occupation is illegitimate and begins to take this to the United Nations. In fact, the UN passes in November Resolution 678, authorizing the creation of a military force that would, authorizing the creation of a military force that would force Iraq out of Kuwait if the Iraqis did not leave of their own accord, and that the continued occupation was illegal. And the United States went on a tour trying to bring different Arab countries into the fold. As we mentioned with Egypt, in order to bring the Egyptians along, the Americans were willing to cancel their debt. In order to bring the Syrians along, the Washington sent an ambassador, which was surprising since the US had cut off relations with Syria in 1983. And in exchange for giving Syria a free rein in Lebanon to remove any anti-Syrian forces, Syria contributed a small number of soldiers, especially considering how much they hated Saddam Hussein. You had other countries like Saudi Arabia, Oman, so on, contributing their forces because this was a direct threat to them. And so you had the creation of a large-scale coalition, and they were operating in the defense of Saudi Arabia, which was a difficult issue to begin with. The reason for this is that Saudi Arabia, having been the birthplace of Islam and a very conservative state, felt that having Western soldiers like the Americans and British actually on their territory could be considered sacrilege. And so it was only through the perseverance of King Fahd of Saudi Arabia that the Americans were able to create bases and positions within Saudi Arabia. And at the same time, they had to be extremely respectful of the local culture when arraying their defenses. And this became what was known as Operation Desert Storm. In total, 500,000 soldiers from over 30 different countries, most of the soldiers being American soldiers, of course, but from all those different countries, arrayed on the Saudi border with Iraq and with Kuwait. It may surprise people, but the first party to attack was actually the Iraqis. So Saddam Hussein was of the belief that if the Americans got a bloody nose, then they would want to retreat, because this wasn't really their war. It was a war in the Arab world on the far side of the planet. And so if the Americans didn't do so well, then they would leave. And in fact, Saddam Hussein was a fervent admirer of the Vietnam War, and he thought that if he inflicted enough painful casualties on the Americans, that the Americans would leave. Well, it turned out the Battle of Khafji did not turn out like the Tet Offensive. And despite moving in with 3 armored divisions, some of his most effective attacking troops over the Kuwaiti border and into Saudi Arabia, the Americans and their coalition allies were able to decisively defeat the Iraqi mobilized divisions and protect the border. This was a huge win for Saudis, because their military hadn't been tested since the 1922 O'Hare Protocol against any Western or significantly. One last thing that's worth talking about in this run-up in 1990 to the war was Nayra as-Sabah. At the time, her last name wasn't known. She gave testimony on the 10th of October 1990 to the United States Senate. And her testimony was put together by Citizens for a Free Kuwait, which was an AstroTurf organization, meaning that it's an organization that's designed to look as if it's from country A when it's really from country B. And this was designed to look American when in fact it was Kuwaiti, and drummed up to create support in the United States for the liberation of Kuwait. Now, Nayra gave testimony that the Iraqis were arriving at hospitals and dashing incubators on the side to kill babies, among other atrocities. Now, it is true that when Iraqis approached the hospitals, that a number of babies died, but it wasn't that Iraqis were thrashing the children about it, but it was about that the hospitals lost power and other sorts of issues attendant with a conquest. Because Nayra was part of the royal family, she had diplomatic immunity, and she has never been sued by either the United States government or affected in any way for giving false testimony that may have brought more Americans in favor of launching a war in Kuwait. There's a comment here: those Saudi bases become bin Laden's cause for holy war against the US over the next decade. That's absolutely correct. That's one of many of his grievances. He saw that the Saudis acquiescing to the presence of Western soldiers in holy Arab lands was a sacrilege. So one thing worth pointing out here worth pointing out here is that Jordan never joined the coalition against Saddam Hussein. In fact, King Hussein and Saddam met periodically throughout the 90s, and Saddam routinely asked Jordan for assistance. And as we'll see, during the 1990s, after the Persian Gulf War, Jordan and Iraq remain the only, Jordan's border with Iraq remains really the only friendly border for Saddam and his forces. And in fact, the Jordanians acquiesce to Saddam Hussein launching Scud missiles over Jordanian territory to target Israel. Now, the point of this Scud missile attack, in parallel with his attack at Khafji in Saudi Arabia, was in order to break up the Arab membership of the coalition. The thought was that if Israel could be antagonized to enter the war against Iraq, then the Arab countries would all pull out because they would not want to be on the same side of a war as Israel was. And accordingly, US President George Bush and George H.W. Bush and his administration reached out to the Israeli government at the time in order to request that they stand down. Considering that the government in Israel was relatively hawkish at that point in time, it was a very difficult ask, but the Israelis did not respond, and to this day have not pressured the new Iraqi government in any way concerning those missiles. Because of Jordan's unwillingness to join the coalition, for the remainder of King Hussein's life, his relationship with the United States was, until he died in 1999, his relationship with the United States was a little frostier than it had been, especially throughout the 70s and 80s, when he had a very good relationship with both the British and with the Americans. So following the Battle of Khafji, over the next few weeks, the US and its allies began to organize how they were going to invade, and then on February 24th of 1991, you can see there was both an invasion of Kuwait itself, led primarily by Egyptian and Syrian soldiers with British assistance, and a much larger American offensive through Iraq itself. The war was over in 6 weeks, and the Americans and their allies emerged victorious. One of the ironies is that because Iran was not able to penetrate deeply into Iraqi territory, this 6-week war destroyed more of Iraq's infrastructure by significant margins than Iran's 6-year crossing of the Iraqi border. Following the end of February, George Bush released several statements, the latest one in that series being, "In my own view, the Iraqi people should put Saddam aside, and that would facilitate the resolution of all these problems that exist, and certainly would facilitate the acceptance of Iraq back into the family of peace-loving nations." Quotes like this show some of the difference between American ways of communication and Middle Eastern ways of communication. In this statement, of course, George Bush did not guarantee anything about what would happen, that he would support the Iraqi people, that this was a meaningful way for them to actually resolve their problems with Saddam, or that he was giving any advice anyway. But from the Middle Eastern position, a lot is usually implied by statements, and so they saw this as George H.W. Bush implying that if they revolted, he would support them. And accordingly, you had large-scale revolts occurring throughout the Iraqi south, especially in the city of Basra. And the thing to take into account is that a significant part of the Iraqi army was composed of Shiites, which meant that they were able to desert with tanks and with other weaponry to create a revolt. And the revolt was actually widely successful. A number of towns in the south of Iraq fell to these Shiites. And in fact, they laid siege to Baghdad, a siege which they eventually lost. But the reason for the loss was not due to lack of numbers or lack of interest. In fact, this rebellion, if it had succeeded, probably would have created something much closer to the Iraqi state that we have now than we ended up getting in the 1990s. But they had no leader and they had no organization. And furthermore, there was a fundamental disagreement between those different Shiite perspectives, especially those of the Islamic Dawah Party, which wanted a secular state, and which appealed to the majority of non-Shiites who were caught up in the rebellion, and Syri, who wanted to create that Islamic guardianship, the guardianship of the jurist, which was something that was untenable to both many Shiites and also pretty much all the non-Shiites. Saddam Hussein was able to bring this rebellion back into line by beginning an aerial bombardment of a number of the cities of the Shiite south. probably most famous of which is the city of Karbala, which is a holy Shiite city, because of a number of shrines there, like the Abbas bin Ali shrine. And you can see here its gold roof being impacted by a missile that Saddam Hussein had launched against the city in order to try and quell the rebellion. When it became clear that the rebellion would be unable to succeed, many of its members fled into the marshes. Now, the marshes are a naturally occurring wetland at the mouth of where the Tigris and the Euphrates meet. And you can see that these marshes are incredibly lush with large amounts of reed and straw. Prior to 1991, the population of marsh Arabs was estimated to be 250,000. And while I use the term marsh Arabs, it's not a term that anybody in the region uses for them. There are several different names, none of them terribly memorable or necessarily neutral. So I'm going to call them marsh Arabs, despite the fact that many Arabs consider them to be non-Arab, that they might be Indian settlers who came in other centuries, or some other immigrant group. Regardless, these marsh Arabs lived a unique way on this marsh, and many of them were Shiite, but many of them were also Mandean, which is an old style of religion that dates back to forms of Zoroastrianism, believing that there are two gods, or one god and one significantly powerful demon, and that these two entities are fighting for the future of humanity, and that they should pray for the victory of the good god, Ahura Mazda. Now, Saddam Hussein saw that many of the Shiite fighters, especially those from the Badr brigades, which was the militant division of Syria, had fled into the marshes. So he acted in all earnestness to drain the marshes, and that drainage started as early as April of 1991. By 1992, the entire set of marshes was drained, and significant portions of the population there were either rounded up or expelled. Even in the wake of repopulation that has occurred since the ouster of Saddam Hussein in 2003, there are only roughly 40,000 marsh Arabs in the same region that previously there had been 250,000 in. But the South wasn't the only group that rebelled. And while the South started rebelling as soon as Bush had issued that statement on March 1st, the Kurds waited a little bit and rebelled on the 5th of March, 1991. Now, the Kurds had stayed out of all of the operations during the Persian Gulf War because of how badly they had been beaten in the 1980s. Remember the Anfal campaign, remember the gassings. There simply wasn't the heart in it for a lot of Kurds because they were just so traumatized by what had happened. But with what seemed like the downfall of the Iraqi state based on the rebellion in the south, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan was willing to initiate a revolt on the 5th of March, and its fighters began launching an attack to liberate more and more territories. The PUK also reached out to a number of other militant groups in its region, like the Islamist Kurdish Alliance and the PKK, which is a communist Kurdish organization based primarily in Turkey. And these two organizations were thoroughly detested by the KDP, the Kurdistan Democratic Party, which was the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan's main rival. So now these two groups, however, set aside their differences in order to expand their power at the expense of Saddam's state. And so Saddam retaliated through the use of bombing raids. This meant that America began to intervene, and the Americans began to intervene under the idea that the Kurdish movement should be protected. So starting in April of 1991, they implemented a no-fly zone at the 36th parallel, meaning that Iraqi fighters couldn't fly north of that region. And that meant effectively that almost all of the Kurdish territories, with the exception of the city of Kirkuk, with the exception of the city of Kirkuk, were really outside of areas that Saddam Hussein could directly take. And this is because those mountains are hard to climb, whereas Kirkuk is in the lowlands. So Jalal Talabani, the head of the PUK, brought his troops to the Directorate of General Security, which was an Iraqi secret police building, and took it over for the Kurds now that they had the power to govern themselves. And because of the no-fly zone, the Kurds had a weird situation in which they had not been guaranteed any rights or political freedoms, but because Saddam Hussein could not enforce his will over them, those line of Babylon tanks that could take Kirkuk couldn't make their way up the mountains. The Kurds actually had their own democratic process. And in 1992, the Kurds had the first democratic election in their history. Of course, we shouldn't be overboard with how momentous this event was, considering that most Kurds did not vote as individuals, they voted as clans. In fact, entire tribes would sell their vote to whichever party paid them. And so what ended up happening is that the vote for 100 seats ended up being 51 for the KDP, 49 for the PUK, and they ended up effectively controlling different regions of Kurdistan. You can sort of see the civil war map sort of pointing out the plot before it happens on the below. Now, these two regions effectively began to rule themselves as distinct entities, with Masoud Barzani of the KDP ruling the KDP region in the northern part of Iraqi Kurdistan, and Jalal Talabani ruling the PUK in the eastern part. And these two groups had internecine and fratricidal war throughout 1994 to 1998, with Washington finally mediating a ceasefire between them and effectively accepting that Kurdistan would be partitioned into areas controlled by both different entities. The fundamental disagreement between the PUK and the PDK, to be honest, was tribal loyalties, but to a certain extent, Barzani believed that he and his family had led the Kurdish revolts since the 1960s. He was the one who created a Kurdish resistance, and accordingly, the Barzanis inherited the right to rule. From the perspective of Talabani and other members of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, the philosophy of the Barzanis was to rule almost like mafiosos with their own fiefdom. And it was more effective to have a government by the Kurds for the Kurds that doesn't necessarily believe in patrilineal lines. That said, Talabani and his children have become the effective leaders of the PUK ever since its inception, not giving way to democracy really in his own movement. There are, of course, major PUK Kurds that are not Talibanis, where nearly every leader of the KDP is a Barzani or married into the family. The Americans also began to, in addition to trying to resolve the situation in Kurdistan, the Americans began to provide weapons and food to the Kurds, as Saddam Hussein had effectively blockaded them starting in 1991. When he realized he couldn't get up the mountains, he figured the Kurds shouldn't be able to get down. And so the Americans began, through Turkey, providing support to the Kurds. And we then move into the animosity that occurred between the Americans and the Iraqis between the wars. So in 1993, it was discovered that there was an assassination attempt on George H.W. Bush. Now, of course, this was during the Clinton administration. He was the former president at the time. But the Kuwaitis discovered the would-be assassins, and they were jailed. But Clinton believed that this was insufficient as a response and launched Tomahawk missiles at Iraq's intelligence headquarters in Baghdad. And you can see the results of that rubble the results of the attack that created that rubble in the upper picture. There were two further attacks, one in 1996 and one in 1998, where the United States launched Tomahawk missiles at Iraq, in each case as a result of a perceived diplomatic injustice. Another sort of major issue that occurred during this time period was the defection of Hussein Kamil. Now, Hussein Kamil was arguing that Iraq during this time was badly managed, and we're going to talk about that in about a minute. But that Iraq at this time was badly managed, and sorry. And as a result, he defected by fleeing with his wife, Saddam's daughter, Raghad, to Jordan, where he began to give testimony to MI6 and the CIA. He also gave testimony to the United Nations, which is much more on the record. And in those testimonies, he argued that despite the United States arguing that Iraq was in possession of chemical and or biological weapons, that he, as the former defense minister, could verify that no such things existed, saying, I ordered the destruction of all chemical weapons. All weapons, biological, chemical, missile, nuclear, were destroyed. There's not a single missile left. Iraq had kept blueprints and molds for production, but all the missiles themselves were destroyed. The Americans and British were not terribly excited by this intelligence and did not object when he returned to Iraq believing that Saddam Hussein had forgiven him. Saddam had sent messengers to that effect. As soon as he got back to Iraq, however, he discovered that was not the case. He was forced to divorce Saddam's daughter, and then he was executed in early 1996. In 1998, the United States still demonstrated that they saw to the stability of the world, and the Senate and the House passed what would be signed by the president as the Iraq Liberation Act in 1998. In fact, it passed the Senate 99-0. In the House, it was a little bit more contentious. And the Iraq Liberation Act would support any organization, group, or entity that overthrew the Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein. One final point to make is that it wasn't just America putting Saddam in this dark position. A lot of his neighbors did as well. While we often talk about how Israel isn't recognized by a significant portion of the Middle East, during this period, neither was Iraq. And you can see only the countries in green of Middle Eastern countries retained relations with Iraq throughout the 1990s. And Turkey is a particularly strange case because, as you can see, the Turkish border with Iraq is entirely with the KDP-controlled regions of Kurdistan. So this meant that Turkey actually had much better functional relations with the KDP than they had with Saddam's government, because that's who they were dealing with at the border. And it's because of the Turkish involvement that the PDK began to receive funding and weapons from Turkey to go after the PUK. And why was that? Because the PUK aligned with the PKK, right? That insurgent Kurdish group with communist affiliation that's a problem in Turkey. So Turkey was now supporting Kurds to kill Kurds on its behalf. The degree of isolation that Iraq felt was immense. And it wasn't just from the Middle Eastern countries as well. It was from nearly everybody because of the UN sanctions regime. UN Security Council Resolution 661 imposed a massive sanctions regime on Iraq, and that resulted in the country losing significantly. And there are a number of stats that we can read off just to give a sense of how difficult the situation was. The water supply in Baghdad decreased 55%, especially with respect to clean water. The literacy rate dropped from 80% to 58% as more people abandoned school because they needed to work to make whatever money they could. In fact, the currency value dropped from a dinar being roughly equal to around $3 in 1980 to a dinar being worth about 0.2 of a cent in 1995. The GDP fell over 90% between 1989 and 1991. Unemployment rose significantly to between 45 and 50%. There was economic liberalization, which, if we remember, the farmers in the 1970s were given usage of collectives. But Saddam Hussein now sold off most of these collectives to large-scale companies, which then decided to mechanize more of the labor and therefore kick more peasants off of the land. And this was combined with the fact that now the military of Iraq had been slashed significantly, both in the People's Army and in the proper army. And yes, to the question, Saddam Hussein absolutely wanted to create two military organizations that feuded with each other. And he's not unique in it, but I think he did it better than most. You then have the situation of a lot of soldiers now coming home from war and not having a job, which forces up the unemployment. And a lot of these soldiers don't have skills to do anything but agriculture, but they're not needed. So it creates a glut in the market. As I pointed out, with the rate of currency dropping, you have hyperinflation. And Iraq was a country that in 1989 was 70% reliant on food imports. You have to remember that Iraq in the 1970s and 1980s was actually much more similar to a Gulf country in that they were simply using their oil to pay for everything. And now that they couldn't because of the sanctions regime, there was simply nothing coming into the country. There were significant medical issues that grew in Iraq during the 1990s. In particular, the child mortality rate more than doubled. And you can see in the picture on the lower right-hand side, a funeral area. It's the Islamic tradition to wrap up a person in white linens before they're buried. And so you can see these are all deceased children who are waiting to be buried. It's estimated, and of course the number is contentious, and there have been studies going back and forward on whether the number is truly accurate or not, that 500,000 more Iraqi children died than would have if the medical situation of 1989 had continued through the 1990s. And the WHO argued that the medical system in Iraq basically took a turn back 50 years. We remember when we talked about the 70s and 80s that Iraq was almost at the level of a Western European state in terms of its medical and healthcare system. By the end of the 1990s, it was among the worst in the region, if not the wider world. In 1996, in order to try and combat the lack of food, the UN created the Oil for Food program. The program was seen to run relatively inefficiently, with over 20% of the money being siphoned off to pay for a number of other UN agencies and monitoring coalitions, which is why you have the cartoon you have there, where the Oil for the Food program goes to the Grease for Palming program. And because Iraq's economy was so dismal, a lot of people resorted to actions on the black or gray market. Probably the most famous of these are the Qatat al-Hisar, or the cats on the wall. It's kind of hard to translate the term. These cats on the wall were a number of smugglers that operated on the Iraqi-Jordanian border. Remember, that is the only friendly border that Iraq shares, because the border with Turkey is with the Kurds, which Saddam doesn't have control over. And so people tended to smuggle everything into and out of Jordan that they could. And because Jordan maintained good relations with the West throughout the 1990s, it provided Iraq a small window by which better things could get in. And of course, during the 1990s, Saddam Hussein was able to consolidate his authority. In the wake of the 1991 uprisings, he killed between 100,000 and 300,000 Iraqis himself with the Republican Guard, which were his elite soldiers, in order to re-inculcate a sense of fear of his person and a respect for his power, which effectively silenced all the different forms of opposition that had come to exist in the intervening period. And so then we move into the situation in the United States prior to the war in 2003. And so there's a number of different issues that we should talk about. The first one is, of course, that in September 11th of 2001, the United States was attacked by the Al-Qaeda terrorist organization based out of Afghanistan. This attack brought down the two towers in New York City, as well as hitting the side of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. And a fourth plane was downed in Scranton, Pennsylvania, before it could hit its final target. Now, the Al-Qaeda organization was subject then to the United States' war on terror, which began to be prosecuted primarily in Afghanistan with the goal of apprehending the members of Al-Qaeda and stopping that terror network from attacking the United States ever again. In the midst of this, there began to be discussions concerning Iraq. And Iraq was first mentioned in 2002 when Bush put together his Axis of Evil speech, in which he put together Iran, North Korea, and Iraq as three countries that were evil countries with designs towards the United States. As I mentioned in the Iranian presentation, Iran was surprised to be included in this coalition because they were actually one of the few Middle Eastern countries, other than Israel or Turkey, which are, of course, U.S. allies, to send condolences to the United States for the terror attack of September the 11th. And, of course, as Sunni Islamists, Al-Qaeda is completely unwelcome in Iran, which is a Shiite Islamist state. But throughout the 2002, the Bush administration, led by its new neoconservatives, and we'll talk about that in a second, created an argument that Saddam Hussein was somehow connected with Al-Qaeda, and therefore he could be harboring them or using them to support him as an extension in order to get back at the Americans for what had happened in the Persian Gulf War of 1991. Now, these neoconservatives are a new kind of politician, and we need to understand sort of the American context here. The United States, coming out of the Cold War in the 1990s, felt that it, as the unitary superpower, had the ability to remake the world and had the ability to move in a direction towards creating more democracy, more liberality, more freedom in more countries. And so you had a number of individuals who felt that the left was not hawkish enough in terms of pursuing this outline, and the right was not. And the right was simply too ideologically conservative in terms of social issues and the rest of it in order to embrace this. And so this resulted in the creation of the neoconservative movement. And of course, you have ideological thinkers like Fukuyama, who became part of that movement. You had, of course, political operators like Paul Wolfowitz, who became part of that movement. But by far, the largest concentration in any government that we've had was in the Bush Jr. administration, where Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, National Security Advisor John Bolton, Paul Wolfowitz himself, and several other individuals, Dick Cheney, who were neoconservatives, began coalescing in power. So these individuals pushed very strong the connection between Iraq and Al-Qaeda to the extent that it could be believed. And there were routinely inspections to determine whether Iraq had chemical weapons. None of those inspections found anything, but Saddam Hussein was being cagey about the presence or lack of chemical weapons, because he felt that he needed those weapons, or at least the fear that they might exist, as a deterrent against Iran. Iran was still supporting and supplying organizations like Syria in the south of Iraq, and he needed to keep a lid on them. So anything to do to keep Iran out, he would, which meant that he was trying to play a tightrope game between submitting to the weapons inspectors and satiating the Americans, but not submitting to them completely, so that there would always be a question mark as to whether he had those weapons in the minds of Iranians. So as we move through 2002 and 2003, we begin to have discussions as the possible invasion of Iraq becomes more and more likely. There are debates within the Joint Chiefs and other military attachés with Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld about how such a war, if it were to be declared, should be prosecuted. Rumsfeld believed in what was called the Rumsfeld Doctrine, where he believed that a small, effective force that could move quickly, that had strong air support and guided missiles, and advanced technological abilities would be able to subdue the Iraqi population, and therefore a small, lean, mean fighting force should be pursued. Many of the generals in the Joint Chiefs disagreed. Probably foremost among them was General Iraqi Shinseki. And Shinseki had been serving already he had served under Clinton and continued to serve under Bush. His view, and he testified in the United States to the United States Senate Committee on Armed Services, that he believed that a significantly higher number of soldiers would be needed, in the hundreds of thousands. If he was put to a number, he would have said 300,000, which was significantly more than Rumsfeld would have liked. And the two of them contended in public through the press rather viciously at each other. It's believed that Shinseki's view, which ultimately did not win out, although history, I believe, shows him to have been correct, resulted in him losing his position as head of the Joint Chiefs, and he wouldn't become part of government until 2014, when Obama tapped him to be the head of Veterans Affairs. The difference between Rumsfeld's desire to send 120,000 soldiers and Shinseki's likely closer to 300,000 would mean that controlling Iraq would be a much more difficult maneuver to effect, because there simply wasn't the manpower to move beyond bases and secure territory. And we're going to see the problem of that as we move through the Iraqi occupation. We also had, for want of a better term, false intelligence. Dick Cheney, in particular, the vice president of the United States, relied heavily on academic Fouad Ajami, who was a Jordanian-American political philosopher. And Ajami believed that it was necessary for the Iraqi government to be overthrown, and that the Iraqis would effectively thank the Americans in the long term for doing it, even if they didn't do so immediately. Now, Cheney's alliance with Ajami was only for as long as Ajami agreed with Cheney's opinions. He's Lebanese American, not Jordanian American. For only as long as Ajami supported his contentions. The other person that's worth talking about is Ahmed Chalabi. Chalabi was from a prestigious Shiite family that moved that had historical power, but under the Saddam regime was forced into exile. And Chalabi had managed to ingratiate himself with a number of Washington elites. He spread a number of false tales about what Iraq would look like after the Americans invaded, and in fact became part of grift in Iraq once there. Ironically, he would be part of the De-Baathification Commission, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And that would cause probably the most difficult point in the occupation to move forward. There's a point here that Cheney profited handsomely from the Iraq War. I agree. He owned one of the private military organizations that were used, which was Halliburton. And so, yes, he used the war to enrich himself. Now, other US allies tried to explain to the United States that an invasion of Iraq would not be meritorious. Probably the most prominent of these was King Abdullah II of Jordan. As we pointed out, Jordan has a unique relationship with both the United States and with Iraq, in that it was the only country that still recognized Iraq under Saddam Hussein in the 1990s, but had throughout the 1990s made peace with Israel and been part of numerous pro-American initiatives in the region. In fact, you can see King Abdullah II in Washington only a few weeks after September the 11th, talking about a joint task force to discover terrorism in both Jordan and the wider Middle East. He argued, and I believe that history has borne him out on this, that one, a toppling of Saddam's government would send a wave of Iraqi refugees into Jordan that Jordan could barely handle, if at all, that it would allow Iran to extend its influence more effectively through Iraq, especially if Iraq was controlled by a Shiite leader, and it would result in the proliferation of terrorism within Iraq to a degree that it didn't currently exist. And as I mentioned, all three of these happen to be rather prescient remarks. And so then we move into the initial American invasion. So once America decides to go to war, they start trying to look for international partners. But unlike George H.W. Bush, who spent half a year and made impressive concessions, such as allowing Iran to get to stop blocking Iran from getting loans from the International Monetary Fund, which allowed Syria to undercut democracy in Lebanon, numerous other things in order to establish their coalition. The United States was not willing to do that long, arduous process or to try and convince with compelling evidence the international community. The one exception perhaps could be when Colin Powell was sent to testify to the United Nations on the 5th of February 2003 that Iraq was still using chemical and biological weapons, still maintaining them. But most nations disagreed. And in many people's eyes, Colin Powell was forever discredited for having been placed in this position. The United States began the invasion in early March of 2003, and the invasion proceeded relatively quickly. Within a few weeks, the American soldiers were already in Baghdad. You can see them invading Saddam's palace. And on the 1st of May 2003, George Bush issued his infamous mission accomplished speech indicating that Saddam Hussein had been removed, that the mission of the American soldiers was over in Iraq, and now it would be a peace maintenance as opposed to a war. Of course, most Americans are familiar that many more Americans died after he made this mission accomplished speech through violent acts, especially during the 2006 to 2008 Civil War, than during this period. Especially those deaths that came from what is called the Sunni Triangle. So between the cities of Baghdad on the southeast, Ramadi in the southwest, and Tikrit in the north is a belt of primarily Sunni villages, places like Samarra, Fallujah, Bakoba, and these areas were very pro-Saddam. And so it was necessarily the case that when the Americans took control and it seemed like they were going to push power away from Saddam, that these areas were among the first to rebel. That rebellion would continue throughout much of the following decade. The United States also spent a significant amount of effort trying to find Saddam's family. They found Uday and Qusay relatively quickly, and they paraded their dead corpses through Baghdad, which of course won lots of hearts and minds in the Iraqi general public. And then later, they found Saddam Hussein in Operation Red Dawn in December of 2003. After Saddam Hussein was discovered, he was put on trial, and that trial lasted through much of 2004 and 2005. The trial concerned primarily Saddam's actions in the attack on Dujail in 1982. where he killed those 144 Shiites. Now, there were other crimes against humanity for which he was ancillarily, alleged to have committed during these trials, such as the attack on Halabja in 1988, in 1986, the wider Al-Anfal campaign, the hangings of the Jews in 1959, in 1969, numerous different issues, but the only one for which he was duly convicted was the Jujail massacre, because that was the only one the prosecutors directly went at him with. And in December of 2006, he was executed for those crimes. During this period in 2003, there was what was called the CPA, or the Coalition Provisional Authority, that was led by L. Paul Bremer. And Bremer was effectively the dictator of Iraq throughout this period, controlling all of the occupation government and redistricting and reorganizing Iraq under him. He met up with a leading member of the Islamic Dawah Party who had been in exile for years. That was Ayad Allawi. And in June of 2004, and June 28th of 2004, he signed over official authority to Ayad Allawi. But many people, including the UN Commissioner who visited Iraq, effectively called Bremer a dictator, even with Ayad Allawi existing as an Iraqi face to the American occupation. Throughout 2004 and 2005 began deliberations on the creation of a new Iraqi constitution. And the new Iraqi constitution did some things that were very different from the way the Iraqi constitutions had historically been created. The first was that it created a parliamentary system. Iraq had historically been a presidential system. And what does that mean? It means that Iraq has now a powerful prime minister and a weak president, as opposed to a powerful president and no prime minister, or a very weak prime minister, if any. And a prime minister and a cabinet are usually formed through consensus building, because in the parliament, which is elected through proportional representation, you have a number of different parties representing a number of different perspectives. And so in order to create a platform, all the parties have to sort of stand together and agree on what they are going to do. This means that Iraq was effectively much harder to govern from the perspective of having a long-term direction, because of how many voices need to be heard. And to complicate matters further, in order to appease the Kurds, the United States implemented a rule that no law could pass if 2 of the 18 provinces within their internal areas vetoed the law internally. Now, Kurdistan is made of 3 different provinces, so this was designed with the Kurds in mind. Therefore, if the Kurds didn't like something, they could veto it. Even if the rest of Iraq agreed, the law still wouldn't pass. And so between the fact that it's a parliamentary system where parliamentarians have to make concessions in order to create coalitions, and any not liked could be subject to a veto, a significant amount of fraud and corruption began to develop in the Iraqi parliament, even after the constitution was made official in 2005, because there was simply no way to create an anti-corruption bill, in the views of many parliamentarians, that wouldn't be shot down by the governing legislature of one or more of the provinces, because of how widespread the corruption was, and these provinces not wanting to deal with that issue. One of the interesting things about the new constitution of Iraq is that it created the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court was a court in charge of interpreting the constitution that was, in most part, that independence has remained. The Iraqi Supreme Court is relatively independent and issues rulings often counter to the legislature, but in many ways it's also seen as a corrupt entity in its own right. In one case, one parliamentarian who was accused of corruption and removed from his seat actually filed in the Supreme Court to have his seat reinstated, and it was. Now, one other issue that really began to boil up because of the way that the parliament is structured is Shiite sectarianism. Shiite Arabs make up about 60% of the Iraqi population, and so naturally stands to reason that under a proportional system, Shiite politicians, or at least those representing their interests, would be roughly 60% of the parliamentarians. Now, of course, as I mentioned, there were divisions between those three approaches: the approach of political separation, but strong influence, the institution of Vilayat al-Faqih, and the creation of a secular Shiite organization. In fact, there will be a fourth, which is sort of where the Sadrists sit now, which is sort of an Iraqi independence perspective, that Iraq shouldn't be influenced by external parties, whereas the other three are more willing to entertain that possibility. But overall, they could agree on certain Shiite policies in the sense of they would benefit Shiites as a group. And so we begin to see, especially with the administration of Nouri al-Maliki, which was the most sectarian administration in the aughts, that Sunnis began to feel less and less heard by the government overall, and more vulnerable to loss of livelihood, loss of profession, and similar. And this comes to a head in the de-Baathification of the country. So in 2006, the United States decides, after a lot of division between the State Department and the intelligence departments, to go for de-Baathification. And this meant that anybody who was a Ba'ath Party member could not be a part of the current Iraqi government. Now, there have been amendments to de-Baathification, and it was finally ended by the current Prime Minister of Iraq, Sudani. But de-Baathification, it was ended like a year ago. It's very recent. The de-Baathification was incredibly deleterious, since most individuals in a high public station in Iraq were Ba'ath Party members. So nearly all of the former military personnel, almost all the educated personnel, significant swaths of technical workers, and so on, were Ba'ath Party. And under this de-Baathification, none of them could get jobs in the public sector. None of them could get jobs in the government. And so this naturally led to more Sunnis inflaming the tensions within the Sunni triangle, with numerous Saddam-era colonels and generals, both from the Iraqi army and from the People's Army, becoming Mujahideen fighters. Now, it may seem strange that their ideology would change from being secular in Saddam's government to being religious or theocratic-oriented, let's say, in the context of a rebellion, but it's more that this was where they could earn a living. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the head of Al-Qaeda Iraq, began to look for these individuals who had been rejected by the Iraqi establishment for now being Ba'athist, and saw them capable fighters. And as long as they would tout his party line, he was more than willing to absorb them into his ranks, which meant that he had effective generals. Remember, this was an army that invaded Kuwait in one day, and had fought Iran for 8 years, meaning that Al-Qaeda Iraq was very difficult to deal with. In fact, the Sunni majority provinces, like Anbar, were the provinces that were the most lethal for American soldiers. In fact, over 70% of American fatalities during the Iraq War of 2003 to 2011 occurred in the 3 Sunni majority provinces. In order to deal with this, American generals began trying to figure out how to recruit Sunnis who had not been Ba'ath Party members, so as to not have to undo de-Baathification. And the way that they did this was through the creation of the Sons of Iraq movement, which was a movement of Sunni sheikhs who reached out to the Americans, and the Americans reached back out to them, who were tired of the way that Al-Qaeda was basically acting like hooligans in their neighborhoods and making the areas relatively unsafe. In exchange for the United States government agreeing to grant them more autonomy and to pay them salaries, the Sons of Iraq coordinated their own militia, and they used that militia in tandem with the U.S. Military to go after Al Qaeda Iraq. And Al Qaeda Iraq actually fled from Iraq into the border regions with Syria by mid-2009. The Sons of Iraq, however, because they were Sunni, were increasingly marginalized during the al-Maliki period, when al-Maliki was prime minister, and he said that the Sons of Iraq didn't need as much funding, didn't need as much protection as they had when the Americans supported them. The Americans were increasingly devolving functions to the Iraqi government in 2008, 2009, 2010, and 2011, as the United States was preparing for withdrawal. We'll talk a little bit about that soon. And one of those functions was the support of the Sons of Iraq. And of course, al-Maliki dropped the ball rather intentionally with them, causing them to see him as a traitor. That's on the Sunni side. On the Shiite side, further to the southeast of the country, you have two major different kinds of civil war. The first one is led by organizations that are pro-Iran, like Asa'ib al-Haq or Jaish al-Mahdi, both of these being Islamist or jihadist military or quasi-military organizations supported by the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary, the Iranian Revolutionary Corps. And these groups fought the Americans in order to try and establish a more Shiite Islamist government than the one that the Americans had created. The other side of this were those like Muqtada al-Sadr, who rejected American influence and increasingly, as time will go on, also rejected Iranian influence. Sadr was most famous for taking over the city created by Abdul Karim Qasim, Medinat al-Thawra, City of the Revolution, and creating it into his own fiefdom, which had since been called Sadr City. American troops spent significant amounts of treasure and power trying to retake Sadr City and liberate it for the Iraqi government. In fact, involved in a lot of those operations were the Kurdish Peshmerga, who were allies of the Americans when the Americans invaded, and were deployed by the Americans in Baghdad and other surrounding areas. So, ironically, the Kurds were part of, in many ways, the U.S. coalition of the willing in the occupation of Iraq. Sorry. For those of you who are a little sensitive, the next slide is not for the faint of heart. So with that introduction, we have to talk a little bit about American crimes and during the occupation, as well as the withdrawal of the Americans. And so there are four different crimes that I want to discuss a little bit about. Of course, the most famous of these was the Abu Ghraib prison scandal. In April of 2004, CNBC showed that there had been torture going on in the Abu Ghraib prison. This is a prison that holds between 7,000 and 7,500 inmates. And a number of those inmates were tortured by several American prisoners. There was no investigation until it was leaked publicly, and there became a public outcry of the individuals involved. We have situations where individuals were electrocuted. We have situations where individuals were forced to perform sexual acts that were non-consensual, let's say. All kinds of different acts, and 2 American soldiers were imprisoned for significant periods of time. Others of them were faced lighter charges, but still significant, and the prison was handed over to Iraqi authorities soon after in order to prevent a return of that. There is the story of the Al-Janabi family. You can see there Abiya. She was a young girl. This is a picture from when she was 8. She was killed when she was 14. there were 5 different American soldiers at a checkpoint. That 4 of them decided that they wanted to just kill some Arabs. And so they went to this girl's house. They killed both of her parents and her younger sister. Her 2 brothers were at school, and so they survived the massacre. And before they had killed her mother, however, they began to, as a collective, have sexual acts with her that were, of course, non-consensual. They then proceeded to blast her in the head repeatedly with gunfire. And all of the 4 soldiers involved were received hefty prison sentences. One of the soldiers had actually been decommissioned prior to this event becoming well known. In fact, the soldiers had accused Iraqi militants of attacking this family before investigation by the Iraqi police unearthed that it was actually these American soldiers. So one of them had been decommissioned from the military, and so he was subject to civilian court and committed suicide in jail in 2014. There's the Al-Haditha massacre, which was a case where in November of 2005, an American convoy got attacked by an improvised explosive device, killed one of the commanders, and so the remaining soldiers were in the chaos and in their grief. They just opened the doors of the Iraqi taxi behind them and shot 5 people. They proceeded to kill an additional 19 unarmed women and children. The leniency with which the U.S. courts handled the perpetrators of the Al-Haditha massacre has inflamed tensions between Iraq and the United States. And furthermore, you have the Nisour Square massacre, which is probably the most famous atrocity after Abu Ghraib, which in 2007, private military contractors working for Blackwater, while they claim that they were being fired at, evidence that has surfaced in court demonstrates that they were not. They fired on Iraqi civilians, killing several of them, and they were all sentenced to extremely long jail terms, if not the entirety of their lives, during the Obama presidency. Now, the issue with Nisour is not that these Blackwater officials were arrested and imprisoned, but that during Donald Trump's lame duck presidency period, he provided pardons to all 4 of the Blackwater perpetrators. And so they, both Iraqis and United Nations aligned individuals have reprimanded the United States for this action in violation of international law. This is not to say, of course, that America was the only country committing crimes during the Iraqi occupation. Far from it. You have numerous violent acts committed by the Iraqi militants themselves. And throughout the United States occupation, it's estimated that roughly 1 million people died, but of those, only 160,000 only were the direct result of American soldiers. The remainder were the results of bombings in public places, especially between 2006 and 2007, as a result of the militant groups often targeting civilians as a way to weaken other affiliate groups. Now, starting in 2008, the United States began to consider withdrawing from Iraq. And in fact, it was George W. Bush who began to initiate discussions with Nouri al-Maliki regarding a phased withdrawal that would terminate in 2011. And Obama decided, even though there were some delays in the initial withdrawal, it was supposed to be periodically from the cities, then from the countryside, then from the country, altogether. Even though there were some delays, Obama held firm to a withdrawal by the end of 2011. And so you can see the last US soldiers leaving on the 16th of December, 2011. It's one of the ironies is that Obama's campaign to get into office was a pledge to end the US occupation in Iraq. And in actual effect, Bush was the one who set the stage for that end. Now, of course, there were many Iraqis who were incredulous that the Americans were actually going to leave. And in fact, under a Republican presidency, they may, like McCain, they may not have. But it was Bush who actually negotiated with Nouri al-Maliki to create that situation. Now, of course, we talked about Arab Spring in an Egyptian context, and there was the whole idea of Asqat al-Nizam, down with the system. In Iraq, the protests were a little bit more muted. People didn't want the regime to collapse. The regime literally collapsed about a decade ago. So the fundamental issues were the fraud and corruption that had proliferated throughout Iraq as a result of the issues that I've discussed with the parliamentary democracy system. And there were some concessions made, like Nouri al-Maliki promised that he would not run for a third term. And if his party won a majority, that the prime ministry would go to a different person. And he also promised electricity subsidies. You also have other kinds of, one other curiosity that's worth pointing out is one of the individuals who was arrested during these Arab Spring protests, one day before the Day of Rage, actually, on 24th February of 2011, was Muntadhar al-Zaidi. And Muntadhar al-Zaidi is very famous because in 2008, he famously threw his shoes at President Bush when he was visiting Iraq as retribution for the sustained violence towards Iraq's civilian population that had occurred during the occupation. He was eventually released and is still a mainstream journalist within Iraq. Within Kurdistan, you had the Goran, or the Kurdish Movement for Change. And the Goran addressed a lot of the significant issues with both the PDK, with both the KDP, the Kurdish Democratic Party, and the PUK, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, in that a lot of the power, especially in the KDP, is concentrated among certain familial cliques, and it's not a universalist system. It's not an all-encompassing system, and that Kurdish power should reflect the Kurdish population. These protests were shot up by the politicians of the KDP, and the KDP and the PUK still do remain organizations ruled by their respective patrilineal clans. We also see at the end of 2011, unrelated to the Arab Spring protests, the Dohuk riots. And the Dohuk riots are in areas of what is Kurdistan, but have large non-Kurdish populations. Dohuk in particular has large Assyrian and Yarsani minorities. Both of these religions permit the sale and creation of alcohol. And so some more religiously fanatic Kurds, after hearing a sermon, basically went and torched a bunch of Assyrian and Yarsani stores that were selling alcohol. The Kurdish authorities ended up restraining these individuals and trying to stop the riot, but the damage had been done. One of the interesting things about the Iraqi protests is that Iraq was also protesting actions in other Arab Springs. On 14th of March 2011, the Saudis began an invasion of Bahrain, which is a Shiite majority island nation in the Persian Gulf. But even though it's majority Shiites, it's ruled by a Sunni king that is a strong ally of Saudi Arabia. And so Saudi Arabia, in order to stop the Arab Spring protests demanding more equality for Shiites in Bahrain, the Saudi leadership was willing to crush that. And so the Iraqi people, especially since Shiites in Iraq were more politically ascendant, they saw the Bahrainis as brothers under a similar situation of previous Sunni tyranny and the possibility for freedom now being thwarted. All right, so we're at time, so we'll cover the war against Islamic State next time as we go through Turkey. So Whew. Questions, comments, clarifications. Please put them in the comment section. And while we're doing that, I'll tell you a little bit about who we are as History Mostly Ancient Discussions. I am Richard, and you've been listening to Middle Eastern Islamic History. Next week, we will finish with the war against Islamic State, at least from the Iraqi perspective, and we will talk about the early post-war history of Turkey. That is the reign of Presidents İnönü and Menderes, the coups of 1960 and the coup of 1980, the increasing difficulties that Turkey is going to have, both in external politics, like the Korean War, the war in Cyprus, the situation with the PKK, and its own domestic changes and transformations as a significant portion of its population becomes more theocratically oriented, and a significant portion is in Europe. And so there's this relationship between Turkey and its diaspora population that begins to fundamentally change politics within Turkey. And so we'll continue with Turkey next week and the week after that. We also have Asian philosophy, European Union security, that I host with Aaron De Los Reyes. We don't have another lesson set up, but we will do that soon. Powerful women and dead languages, as Zach mentioned. Jane Prendergast is going to take a break from her Powerful Women series this month in order to talk about contact between the Americas and the Old World, especially in the ancient period, to the extent that existed. We've got our discussion on arms and armor, and of course, we had our presentation on Ukraine relatively recently. That was this past July, and perhaps in August or in September, we will have another Ukraine episode to discuss the southward offensive of the summer offensive of the Ukrainian military. And so, of course, back to questions, comments, and clarifications. So I really appreciate all the fine messages. I hope that you come back. The link for this presentation is the same. So if you use this Zoom link, you'll be able to, at the same time next week, you will be able to get into the follow-up session and everything else. So any questions? Anybody want to make a comment? Of course, if you want to raise your hand, more than happy to listen. Aaron, I noticed that you were talking about a few different documents. Do you want to just talk a little bit about what you found? There's a question. How do I know all this information? Is this my line of work? I'm a lawyer by trade. This is my part of the world. My family is Iraqi, and I really love talking about this place and its history, and I hope that it sort of explained a little bit about what's going on in a way that perhaps the media doesn't really cover or explain. And of course, there are stories that I couldn't add because there's just not enough time, such as how Petraeus actually had meetings with the Sons of Iraq, or how Muqtada al-Sadr, his policy slowly began to change over time, and all these different things about how each one tried to assassinate the other. But it's just trying to create this story that you can understand as somebody who's not as connected in this part of the world. And I hope I made it a little bit more accessible to you about what happened. Aaron?
Great. Yeah, no, so I put a couple pieces of content in there that I think people might appreciate, because either they forgot about, or it's been so long, or if maybe they age-wise never, this is sort of history for them. I think one fascinating dimension is the fact that you really almost had for those of you that are aware of what sort of Guns of August means, and I know Patty is, where you almost had this march to some conclusion. Not that anybody in 1991 or 2 or 3 would have been able to predict in 2003 X, Y, or Z would happen, but that there were behaviors by all the actors that sort of that maintain a continuity of a low and simmering, boiling conflict. So, right, which I think most people forget, is right after President Clinton was inaugurated in '93. I think it was within a few months, President Bush, H.W. Bush, went to Kuwait, as a post-presidency, and there was a thwarted assassination attempt, which is one of the articles that I put in there, and that wasn't like a kind of nut job running on the lawn, which is bad too, because that's in the history of the world. That yeah, exactly. In the history of the world, that's been probably half the time or 3/4 of the time when those kind of assassination attempts happen. But this was a state sponsored, and there was direct attribution back to Iraq, and what that did is that really built a continuity in the policy of isolation of Iraq throughout the '90s, I do think that's a dimension that it's not a crudgel or a justification for the invasion 10 years later, but it sets the stage for all these actions and reactions by all the parties. Another piece I put in there was the '06 to '08 Civil War, which it's sort of interesting. It was never at that time classified as sort of a civil war, right? It was just looked at as a sort of continuation of the loss of the occupation and the loss of and the vacuum of power and the loss of state control. But I think it became pretty clear that by 2010, let's say within a year or two after, that was literally a traditional civil war along ethno-religious lines. And
I mean, this is actually one of the things that I like to point out with Iraq, is that with regards to the Sunni triangle, it was certainly ethno-religious. With regards to the Shiite insurgencies in the south, a lot of the time Shiites were killing other Shiites.
That's
it was
right.
entirely tribal and based on which political allegiance you had, whether you're more pro-Iranian, more pro-local, more secular, more religious, more clan territorial based, or you were more fluid Iraqi. Like there were all these different divisions between the different sides, and it was just sort of a game of that more than anything else.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I do think one thing that has rarely been studied, and I can upload that also, and a pretty good PDF on it, is the fact that when you look at the scale of sort of ethnic group and tribal affiliation, and clan affiliation, that there's which the tribe is the Ashriya, right? That's how you say it correctly. Is that right?
Ashriya. I'm not sure what Ashriya is actually.
Yeah, so I thought that tribe and clan is Fuktiya. Is that and clan and house is Bit, and then like extended families Khams. Yeah, and so that structure, which there's somewhere between 1 and 200 of these we'll call them large tribes throughout Iraq, that, like you said, there are these really complex, it's just a complex matrix, really is the only way to look at it, right? It's like a modern very dysfunctional corporation that's all over the world, and dozens of business units and divisions, and the right left hand don't know what's going on and don't care and work against each other, and and so on. And but you have that at like a state level, and I do think that was something let's say locals in the region who really knew the ins and outs obviously were hyper aware of, and had vested interest in relationships in those, and cross clan relationships. But I do think that was that's always been grossly underestimated by really almost any outside power that has been party, including the UN, over the last 30 to almost 40 years. Because really, to be honest, there's almost nothing in the sort of post World War II institutions that are really built for that, even to this day, to sort of mediate and manage an environment that's really that complex, and especially post, and you talked about it in prior episodes, the construction of Iraq, we'll call it semi-arbitrary, nature of its design, and I do think that that was a tinderbox, and the moment you kind of set it off, or let's say rearrange all the power dynamics, which were already getting rearranged in the 90s post. I mean, you could argue the moment the rearranging started when Iraq invaded Iran, and it shifted from this Gulf-like economic trajectory, right? Because you can almost say the Iraq of the 60s and 70s was sort of on a straight line to being a Gulf-like Emirates-rich superstate.
Yeah.
And especially given its size, would have been quite unique, in that, in terms of the population size.
It was basically going for Norway, like that. That would have been the right parallel.
It would have been like that, and then you have this from the moment they invaded, Iran, or started the war, the last 40, plus years. It's sort of they're like charging backwards, some of which it wasn't maybe directly their fault. Most of it was. I mean, I would say most of it was the regime, not the people, maybe, but the regime and its construction. And I do think that's ultimately what was sort of blown apart through the invasion and the subsequent, let's say, 3-4 years until the Civil War. And I really think into that vacuum is this, we'll call it, modern Iraq Shia, similar to Syria, but not quite, but I would say closer to that, just a much bigger version, and stronger minority populations, right? Which now the Sunni obviously are in that forever second place, when they were in the forever first place. And I do think that's a real fundamental challenge in this post-conflict environment, because outside of an organic, Hezbollah type Shia movements, almost all of the heavy clan violence is coming from the what used to be the legacy strongest, Sunni tribal clans and groups, whether it was the Tikrit, the Samaras, all the places, the Fallujahs, which all have different meanings now given the war, but prior they had, they were robust, tribal clan, almost like large mafias in Italy for the last century or two, and I do think that's a real challenge fundamentally to the stability of Iraq, is trying to bring those Sunni populations back into the fold, and they have you didn't really talk about this, but and I'm not 100% sure on the formula, but I know there's a ministerial formula of a certain number of ministries that are reserved for Sunnis, and then obviously a much smaller number that's for Kurds. No,
there's certain ministries that are reserved for each. The prime minister,
it's like 50, it's like 50, 30, or 55, 30, 15, or something like that, right? It's some mix like that.
It's something like that. The exact numbers I don't know. I know, for example, that the presidency is reserved for the Kurds, even though the presidency is, of course, in a parliamentary democracy like Iraq is now, the presidency is primarily a ceremonial position, as the head of state.
90% of Israelis couldn't name the Israeli president
because it's irrelevant.
Exactly.
But yeah, the prime minister is pretty much guaranteed to be Shiite.
Yeah.
Just from the popularity contest. There's a question, at some time, can you speak about Kurdistan, Kurdish groups in Iraq? Who was able to move to the US after all the troubles and genocides? I'm new to all you've spoken about and have a Kurdish acquaintance here who has told me about his family's troubles about 20, 25 years ago. Okay. Sure. We can definitely talk about Kurdistan. I have some Kurdish slides. Let me just close this and then I can open that up.
Oh yeah, and one other thing, as you're pulling that up, a third piece that I had added was you could argue, second Civil War. I didn't realize actually that's how it's been classified, but till I read this document that I put in to the chat, which is the Syrian. I mean, I knew the Syrian Civil War was classified that way. I just never made the logical jump, for obvious reasons, between 2011 and 2013, that in essence was a second Iraqi civil war. So yeah, I do think it's really, to understand Iraq, it's so fundamental to understand this, 2006 through 2013, 14 Iraq, because it's not to suggest that the invasion wasn't the catalyst or a massive trigger, but ultimately the challenges, the modern challenges that Iraq has is really stemming from this incredible civil war they had for 4 of those 7 years.
So, quick Kurdish history 101. So if we go back to the Ottoman Empire period, so that's with regards to Iraq, the Ottoman Empire controls most of Iraq from about the 1560s onward. So if you look at this map of the Ottoman Empire from its height, which is roughly that time, you can see that I've got some of the provinces in green and some of the provinces in purple. Those provinces in purple are autonomous provinces. And by that, what I mean is that these provinces have significantly more authority locally than do other provinces of the Ottoman Empire. And if you notice, most of these provinces in northern Iraq today are autonomous provinces, and they were ruled by the Kurdish Agha. The Agha was a title, like a prince or a noble. And because they had so much power, you begin to have this idea that sort of develops in the Kurdish regions of the Kurds being somewhat independent relative to, let's say, look, if you look at the Arab, a lot of the Egyptian population, the population of most of the Levant, there's an exception here for Lebanon, where the Maronites live. There's an exception here for Kuwait, which is somewhat independent, but most of Mesopotamia is direct provinces, most of Syria too. The Kurds have this idea that they are somehow distinct or separate from the wider Turkish population. And so we have to understand the Kurdish situation on this continuum of that they're not independent in that they don't have their own foreign policy, they don't have their own currency. And if there is a dispute between different Kurdish tribes, the Ottoman Empire's military might intervene, but on the other hand, it might not. So you have wars between these different Kurdish principalities, and you can sort of see the zoomed in picture here, where you see all these different Kurdish principalities that are all nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, but they will fight over territory and they'll fight over resources, and they will act more independently than you would expect states in a federation to act. Even states in Switzerland would never do this, despite the fact that they have significant autonomy, right? As we move towards the modern states, we begin to see the Kurds reasserting something closer to this independence, because the modern states try to push for increased centralization. And so the Kurds resist this increased centralization. This is the first time during the British Mandate, right? This is in 1922. You have Barzanji, who creates an independent Kurdish state in what's today the district of Suleymaniye. And they are able to fight the British back for basically 2 years before the British overwhelm the position. The reason that they're able to survive so long is that the Turks actually supported this Kurdish rebellion in order to force the British out of northern Iraq, right? That was their goal, because Turkey wanted to annex northern Iraq. So you see Shafiq Özdemir, and we're going to, which was a who was a Turkish general siding with Barzanji. And one of the consistent behaviors that we see among the Kurds is that the Kurds will be the pawns of foreign powers that have a localized goal that the Kurds can somehow participate in, but at the same time, the Kurds need that external support. So the Kurds are willing to look for external support. So you have this sort of meeting of the minds between peoples who might otherwise disagree. Right. Shafik Özdemir obviously did not want Kurdish independence in the areas that Turkey controlled, nor did he want it really in Iraq. He wanted eventually Kurds to become part of Turkey. On the Iranian side of the border, you also had Kurdish moves for independence. And in fact, you have Simko Shikak, who fought during World War I and tried to declare Turkish independence in the northwestern part of Iran before Reza Khan from Tehran conquered the region and reunified Iran under the Pahlavi dynasty. This was a huge revolutionary period in Iran. And you also had him reaching out to Barzanji. You can see this letter here trying to push for some kind of Kurdish unification. That didn't work. The two leaders couldn't get along. And this is another theme that we often see during Kurdish history, is that you have Kurdish leaders from different tribal clans that are trying to establish some sort of unity polity system. And because of their tribal links and because of their quest for power as individual leaders and individual tribes, they can't unify. And that's the situation here. And Simko Shikak loses after the battle of, after the siege of Chehri Castle, which you can see in that picture. And Shikak was assassinated in 1930 by the Shah. You also have the Kurdish rebellions that occur in Turkey at the same time. And these are the Azadi revolts in 1924. And you can see Sheikh Azadi means independence in Kurdish. And you can see in this map the Turks converging on all sides on the region of Kurdistan within the territory of Turkey. And Sheikh Said's revolt is put down. And because the Turkish military is much more modern than the military of Iran, that repression includes bombing from airplanes and large-scale massacres like the massacre of Dersim in 1937. And so the Turkish response to the Kurds is to effectively try to erase their culture and to Turkify them, make them speak Turkish, and the rest of it. But we should understand that the Kurds aren't completely victims. So they're also perpetrators. And during the situation during World War I, many of them were responsible for the perpetuation of the both Armenian and Assyrian genocides. Right, so these are both Christian minorities. They're slightly different in terms of their Christian belief and in terms of their ethnic origin, but both of these minorities were targeted both by Hamidiye, which are Turkish irregular soldiers, and by paid Kurds. And this would be repeated during the Simele massacre of 1933, where Assyrians were targeted again by Kurds, along with support from the Iraqi national military, which had moved by 1933 to being a quasi-independent state as opposed to simply a mandatory state of the British. During the 1950s, when the monarchy was overthrown in 1958, Abdul Karim Qasim tried to reach out to Mustafa Barzani, who was a Kurdish leader in northern Iraq, and tried to create an alliance with him based on the promise that Barzani would get Kurdish autonomy. And in fact, in 1959, he helped stave off a Nasserist rebellion against Abdul Karim Qasim. But by 1961, Barzani felt that the autonomy wasn't forthcoming, and so he launched a revolt against Abdul Karim Qasim. And so that war was from 1961 until 1968, where the Kurds were repeatedly victorious despite having fewer numbers because of Israeli military ingenuity supporting them, because of Iranian military arms supporting them, and Soviet protection in the international sphere. In addition to the fact that the Iraqi army was just not well designed and the country was incredibly unstable. But And so we sort of get to where we were at the beginning of tonight's episode, which is that in 1970, Mustafa Barzani was able to sign an advantageous agreement with the Ba'ath Party under Saddam Hussein, but that agreement was undercut in 1974 because of the centralization of Iraq finally being able to push the Kurds back, and the pushing of Iran out of the Kurdish world in 1975 meant that the Kurds were now isolated. And so you really have the suffering that the Kurds undergo during the Iran-Iraq war on both sides of the Iranian and Iraq border. On the Iranian side of the border, the Kurdish Democratic Party of Iran, led by Abdurrahman Ghazemlu, who you can see there, was supported by the Iraqis against the Iranians. And that party was vilely attacked by the Islamic Republic. And conversely, within the territory of Iraq, Iran supported the Kurds in their rebellion, and Saddam authorized the Anfal campaign to forcibly confiscate the property of the Kurds and to gas a number of their villages. And those that weren't gassed were taken to concentration camps like Baharka. And this occurred throughout the 1980s, which for the Kurds was the darkest decade, really. You then had the Kurdish revolts in 1991, which basically secured Kurdish autonomy, although they then fed into the Kurdish civil war, again, where the KDP and the PUK, representing different tribal coalitions, were unable to create a unitary government and would repeatedly engage in internecine conflict between 1994 and 1998 until they were able to establish a peace treaty, which basically gave them both de facto control of the territories where they were already well established. And that situation sort of remains to this day. The KDP still controls Erbil and Dohuk governance, and the PUK still controls Suleimania governance. Then during the Iraqi civil war, the Kurdish regions were relatively unified. They were able to hold together more or less, and were very supportive of the Americans because the Americans guaranteed them a number of rights under the Iraqi constitution. And then, of course, we have the Islamic State wars, which targeted regions held by the Kurds. And so you have the Peshmerga, which are the Kurdish forces that were the primary instrument in attacking Islamic State. Of course, there's a lot of difficulty with that and initial failures, especially for minority groups like the Yarsani or like the Yazidi, who are, at least in the Kurdish view, ethnically Kurds, but religiously non-Muslim. From the perspective of Yazidi and Yarsani, there's much more controversy as to whether they're distinct ethnicities as well. And the Kurds are sort of in an interesting position where now they have a certain degree of power, but they have a number of minorities under them, like the Yazidi and Yarsini that I mentioned, like the Assyrian Christians that I also mentioned earlier, like Turkmen, which are ethnic Turkish people, and of course, Arabs. So they're in sort of a unique situation. And they're trying to fight off Iranian influence because they don't trust the government of Iran relative to at least the Americans. Now, of course, the Americans lost a lot of goodwill when it came to the situation in northern Syria because the Trump administration pulled out of northern Syria, where there's a Kurdish military presence, and allowed the Turks to take the northern part of Syria, including the city of Afrin, and a number of other border towns. You can see, for example, this is the Turks overtaking the Kurdish position. You can see, for example, where it says Zagunsaz, that is actually Kurdish, and they're sort of overlaying it with the Turkish flag because now it's under Turkish authority. So I think that should cover Kurd 101. The Al Anfal campaign was probably the closest thing. Well, it was a Kurdish genocide. There are debates as to how many Kurds were directly killed or targeted. On the low end, you have numbers like 40,000. On the high end, you have numbers like 186,000. Most scholars tend to put it around the 70,000-80,000 range. But there you go. All right, any last questions before I close this out? All right, so I will see everybody next week when we'll talk about Islamic State and the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in Turkey. All right, see ya, everybody. Bye.